So I'll just kick off first. I just want to say that as an Aboriginal man, it's very important that I acknowledge where I am today, and it is a pleasure to be here on Marawarang country. I love coming down here. It's just so brilliant. And I've been down a fair bit over the past few years, doing some work with Geelong City Council in the lead up to the referendum and their work on 26 Jan. Unfortunately, I believe that council has gone a little bit haywire of late, but that's not my story to tell. But I do acknowledge that I'm here on beautiful Marawarang country, and you're dead right, it's just one of the most beautiful areas in Victoria. I consider there's nothing else in the world apart from Victoria. I'm very one-eyed. And my respect always goes out to their elders who've been so generous in permitting me to work and report on their country, and to their elders. I do want to say, before I flick over to Andrew, to start off with a very important little narrative, is that this is a place of respect. And I believe that wherever we talk about First Nations, wherever we talk about particularly important social issues, that there must be respect. And that is respect from the speakers just as much as respect from the audience. I'm very, very open to hearing different views. As a journalist, that's what I hear most of the time. And I encourage people to tell me their views, to ask questions based on their experiences, their knowledge, their lack of knowledge, and their beliefs. If a question is asked respectfully and in a respectful manner, then I will do my best, and so too will my good friend Andrew will respond as well. Andrew and I have spoken quite a few times together, especially in the lead up to the referendum, and a number of times we came up against rather strange people. I think the best for us together was at Hall's Gap. That was a bit of a crack at that one, but I enjoy that sort of stuff. I enjoy being heckled, but that's just me. But that is not to everyone's liking, and I think it's really important that we do hear from Andrew as to really what happened at Anglesea on the 26th of January 2024, because that led to this event. So over to you, my brother.
Thanks, Uncle Charles. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the Warrawong peoples. Beautiful to come down, it's a beautiful part of the world, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here or watching it online, and also acknowledge the continuing and unceded sovereignties of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. So I've had the real pleasure of working with Uncle Charles for quite a number of years. He's a good friend of Reconciliation Victoria. I think you've emceed a number of our events over the past few years, and then particularly last year we worked very closely together on a number of Reconciliation Victoria events on The Voice, but also some other Voice events as well. So yes, as you say, there was some times that we were heckled, but there was some interesting experiences we had in that event. So really delighted to be back here on Warrawong country. I think the elephant in the room is the Anglesea event on January 26th. Uncle Charles and I talked a bit about how we'd focus on that event in this presentation today. We don't want to talk about it too much. We want to move forward. We want to talk about generally the issues about reconciliation in a post-referendum era, which is what the book's about. And that's the really key thing we want to talk about now, about a whole range of key reconciliation issues. How can the reconciliation movement move forward after the devastating referendum loss? But it is important to acknowledge why we've come here today. So for those who aren't aware, I just suggest a bit of a plug for Uncle Charles here. If people want to know more about the actual issue, we'll talk about it briefly here, but Uncle Charles and I did a podcast on the issue, so if you just Google my name and Victorian Aboriginal News, you'll find that out. National Indigenous Times also asked me to write an article on it, so you can search for more information that way. But just in brief, I was invited down to speak on January 26th. I advised my speech would be on truth-telling. I gave the organisers my details about who I was, my roles at the university, my roles at Reconciliation Victoria, and I gave a link to some of the publications I've written over the last 25 years, and I've written about reparative justice, truth-telling, addressing racism, so it was fairly clear what my work is about. Very disappointingly, halfway through the speech, I was heckled by the crowd. And as Uncle Charles said, that not necessarily wasn't that new, but what happened next was new. Unlike any event I've spoken at over the past 25 years, I was asked to stop talking by the organisers, and that was most disappointing. I've never experienced that before. And that was very distressing, to be honest, to be really brutal about it. I was surprised the MC didn't get up and say, we've invited him to speak. He's an expert in this area. If you don't want to listen, you can leave, but please respectfully listen. Instead of that, I was told to get off the stage, and then I had to walk through the crowd as I left. And so I thought about it afterwards. I was positioned as the outsider. I was positioned as the intruder, the interloper. And when I walked off the stage, the insults, the FUs, the P-offs at me from people quite close to me, that was really frightening, to be honest. And these were people in their 30s and 40s, people a lot younger than me. I had no idea what was going to happen. I just wanted to get through that crowd as quickly as possible. And the thing that was going in my mind was that morning I tried to get my 16-year-old twins to come down to Anglesey from Melbourne for the event. Thank goodness they're computer addicts. And they said they'd rather stay at home and play computer games, because in all honesty, the idea of my twin boys seeing their father treated like that would have been a lot for them to cope with. It was a lot for me to cope with. So that was very disappointing. But I have to say, there were a number of people that came up to me. I was about to leave. A number of people came up to me horrified at what had happened and asked me if I was okay, said that this doesn't represent Anglesey, and were just appalled both at the crowd but also at the organisers' lack of support for me as their invited speaker, and their failure to provide a care, to address their duty of care to me as a speaker. And since then I've been contacted by the most amazing people from Anglesey and Torquay, those wonderful people who organised this event tonight. So there's been a lot of positives come out of it. Obviously it was devastating at the time, but Nicole Finlay, the CEO of Reconciliation Victoria, and I were invited to the Surf Coast Shire, met with the Mayor, met with their RAP working group. And again, they weren't involved in the organising the event, but they were just horrified that this happened on their soil. And they wanted to talk to us about the work they do. Reconciliation Victoria has a really strong relationship with the Surf Coast Shire. We do a number of partnerships, so that was wonderful to talk to them. And then that same day I met a number of these wonderful elders from Anglesey and Torquay and elsewhere at the local pub, and we planned this event. So I'm really delighted to be back. It's like being, returning to what was quite a distressing moment. It's disappointing we didn't have it in Anglesey, but I understand that we just couldn't get a venue, but lovely to be here in Torquay. And really looking forward to, learning from what happened then and to move forward. And I think that's what we want to see tonight, because I think what happened that day was a bit of a microcosm of what's happening around the country. And in my interview with Uncle Charles, and also in the National Indigenous Times article and elsewhere I've written, I've made it really clear that this feeling, this oppression, this marginalisation, this exclusion is happening to Indigenous people all the time. And I'm not trying to say this just happened to me, this happens to Indigenous people all the time. And if I can use my voice, my platform, to call this out for what it is, white fragility and racism, if I can call that out, that might help address some of these issues. But there's no doubt, we can talk about this in a bit more detail in a sec, but there's no doubt since the referendum, you've had a group of people that have seen a result about a particular public policy, a First Nations voice to Parliament. They see the rejection of that policy as a way to reject all the things we've all worked for over the last 30 years in reconciliation. So we'll probably leave the Anglesey bit at that and move forward onto some of the other key things we want to talk about. Mr. Charles.
I think it's really interesting that you point out that so many people, especially in the conservative side of life and the conservative politics and conservative media, who do regard, well, with the death of the referendum, that's the end to Indigenous rights. And really what I think is that people fail to grasp the fact that the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is the most amazing document I think that's ever been penned on this country, and believe me, I'm a Banjo Patterson fan, so I'm putting it above Banjo Patterson. But to say that essentially, well, with the failure of the referendum, the Uluru Statement is dead, is absolute crap. What we saw with the referendum was an attempt by the government to implement that voice to Parliament within the Constitution. Because that political move failed does not mean for a second that the voice is dead, the push for the voice is dead, or treaty is dead, or truth is dead. And we see that starkly here in Victoria, with the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria doing amazing work. And actually, I think in only a couple of weeks, we're all going to be down here at Geelong, or Geelong as it's more commonly known now, for a 3-day statewide treaty conference, which I'm very excited to be covering. Treaty is well and truly alive. There will be a statewide treaty this year. It'll be penned, it'll be started. We're seeing the Europe Justice Commission, which is doing work that is just, to say it's groundbreaking is underselling it massively. It's doing incredible work. I read today on LinkedIn that Sue Ann Hunter was saying that the Premier, Jacinta Allen, was in giving evidence. This is groundbreaking stuff. So with the referendum not getting up, voice, treaty, truth, First Peoples' rights is far from dead. It's just one little campaign happened to not work. But it was a national one, so we all took it seriously, and the Conservatives loved it. And that's a great shame. And my goal is I want to get out to those Conservatives and say, okay, what I want is you on our side when it comes to voice, treaty, truth. Because I believe that everybody, once they understand the truth, once they understand where it's all coming from, they will recognise that, no, it's far from dead.
And Victoria's the key state, and that's exactly the part of the speech that I got to before I was shut down, was to talk about the work of the Europe Justice Commission and the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. Because as you be aware, hands up who've read the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Yep. And guess what? It's only one page too. That was one of the many. It was like a fish, wasn't it? It started off at 3 pages, 5 pages, but it was just one page. And I agree with Uncle Charles. It was one of the most beautiful statements I've ever read in my life. And why this hurt Indigenous people so much was that this was a deliberate invitation to the Australian people. So if you go back through the political history, the Barunga Statement, the Yirrkala Bark Petition, you go way back 50, 60, 70, 80 years, all the other previous calls for voice and justice and truth to be led in this country were direct calls to the Australian government, and they were all rejected. There were promises made and they were rejected. Bob Hawke promised a treaty back in 1988, still waiting for that one. Then he imposed reconciliation process but didn't actually lead to a treaty. So this was a call to the Australian people. And so the rejection didn't come from the Australian government, it came from Indigenous people's workmates, their neighbours, their friends, the people they play sport with, people they go to church with. So that's why it was so hurtful. And there's been many things that have happened since the referendum. And this rejection of the whole Uluru Statement, this assumption that is being rejected, is just not true. So as you remember, the Uluru Statement calls for a voice, treaty and truth. The Albanese government has actually committed the election night, and another one of the myths that we had to combat during the election, the Uluru Statement did not come about with Anthony Albanese talked about it when he won the election in 2022. It's been going on for many, many years. Constitutional reform's been going on since last century. But he committed not only having a First Nations voice to Parliament referendum, but to implementing treaty and truth as well. Now that has not happened yet, and one of the very big disappointments since the referendum is the Albanese government has backed away from some of those commitments. That's really disappointing. Further than that, if you look at all the other state governments, only in Victoria is there still a commitment for voice, treaty and truth. So the Queensland government, the New South Wales government are slowly backpedalling a bit. In both states, the opposition has gone from being supportive to being opposing, as has happened in Victoria, with the Liberal National Party rejecting the notion of a treaty. So the whole country, just to let people know, is looking at Victoria to see if it'll work. Well, guess what? Voice is already operating in Victoria. The First Peoples Assembly of Victoria has been in operation for a number of years, and it's doing great work, as Uncle Charles said. The Europe Justice Commission is doing amazing work. You can actually watch those interviews online, and I remember watching the Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police being questioned by the Europe Justice Commission. We found out things such as they don't have compulsory cultural competency training for police officers. So the Europe Justice Commission is this nation's first truth-telling body, and they're doing exceptional work in trying to uncover a whole range of key issues. And so the treaty is going to happen this year. Elsewhere, the only really big thing that's happening across any other state and territory, South Australia just went to a vote yet last week for a South Australian voice to Parliament. So that's in the legislation. So there will be an Indigenous voice to Parliament at the local level in South Australia. But the rest of Australia, they're sort of hedging their bets at the moment to see what's going to happen. That's why I think it's absolutely critical for the reconciliation movement to keep advocating. It's one of the key themes in the book. Sorry, that's the last plug for a while, for the book. But it's one of the key themes that is our role as reconciliation advocates, to keep putting that pressure on to not throw out the Uluru Statement from the heart, to keep advocating for voice, treaty and truth at local levels, at state levels, and ultimately at the federal government level as well. And that's where I think we've got really concerns that there has been that backpedalling on the voice, treaty and truth.
And I think also that we talk extensively about the federal government and the state government, but I'm a big advocate for local government, for reform at local government, and I think this is where so much happens. I'm very fortunate that I'm a part of an advisory committee, an Aboriginal advisory committee to the Banyule State or local government, and that was the third local government to endorse in full and unanimously the entire Uluru Statement from the Heart, and that was back in December 2022. So much actually happens at the local government level. Now, I know that in Geelong City Council, there was enormous work happening there, phenomenally good work happening there. And I really urge everybody, because we all live on a local government or local government boundaries, that if you really want to promote reconciliation, if you want to promote change at a local level, and what you do is you get onto your local ward councillor or councillors and give them curry. I'm really serious. I was telling Andrew about this earlier. I went to an event today, and I shouldn't say this, a lovely lady took me there to a 2.5 hour yarn about, oh God, she's going to see the video now, this will not be good. So, sorry, Margaret, but to a lovely 2.5 hour presentation about apologising and giving forgiveness. And it was lovely, but afterwards I said to my friend, but what were the calls to action there? And there were no real calls to action. And I think that everybody attending any event, if you don't walk away with either a given call to action or a self-imposed call to action, then you've just wasted your time. So I'm going to give you a call to action right now. And that is that you lobby your local council to strengthen its reconciliation action plan or its Victorian Aboriginal local government strategy, whatever strategy it has in place, that they strengthen it. That you put yourself forward to the local advisory committees or the local gathering places as an ally or as a First Nations person, as a member, because they have direct connections also to local government. Don't ever for a moment think or echo the sentiment that local government is roads, rates and rubbish. That in itself is unadulterated rubbish. Local government is where change happens. Local government feeds right through and lobbies to state government and also to federal government. State governments pay attention to what local governments are saying. I've sat and interviewed state ministers at time, and I've heard from them firsthand that yes, they have made decisions in Parliament and it's affected legislation as a result of lobbying from local councils. And local councils listen to only one group of people. That's you. And that's what you can do. Reconciliation is not dead. Reconciliation didn't even really hiccup as far as I'm concerned. Reconciliation has continued and will continue, but it needs people to get off their backsides and to actually do something about it. It's all well and good, sorry, I'm just going to say this one thing. It's all well and good once a year to go and do a march. I'll tell you right now, I don't do marches. I refuse to do marches because of one thing, because I prefer to work in the background and continually bring actions to bear on those who will bring about change. And that's the call to action I give all of you. You're all capable of some action. That, for me, is reconciliation in action. But Andrew, being the academic, will have a different view on things.
No, I completely agree. I was going to support everything you said about local government. I mean, back when reconciliation was created in the 1990s by Bob Hawke, which was actually done as a way to throw off the issue about treaty and national land rights. But in that 10-year period of formal reconciliation, local councils were seen as the key way to move reconciliation forward, because reconciliation is done at a local community level. So I completely agree with Uncle Charles. Local governments are critical. And that's why it was so devastating during the referendum, that unlike with marriage equality debate, which really the institution in Australia that really led marriage equality debate were the local governments, who were brave, made big, courageous decisions to come out. Where were they during the referendum? Banyule was an exception. There's half a dozen in the country that actually went and supported it. Most councils were very reluctant to engage. Uncle Charles and I spoke at a number of events and I spoke at others where we were invited by the council. We had to speak under the guise of a civic education campaign, because you couldn't actually come and say, I mean, I still turned up in my Yes t-shirt, but we actually couldn't formally have a strong Yes position as the event advertisement, because the council had to be neutral. That's a real concern. Most of these councils have Indigenous advisory bodies. So if they understand the importance of First Nations voices in their own councils, why would they advocating for First Nations voice to Parliament? Similar thing to RAP organisations. I was very critical of a lot of RAP organisations during the campaign, including leading RAP organisations, many of which didn't take a position. So how can they advocate and understand the importance of First Nations voice in their own organisation, yet fail to do that for the national body? So completely agree with your call. Actually, if I may be permitted to have one as well, is to keep learning, to keep educating. I've had a lot of people say to me, oh look, we've got 6.2 million people over the line, we don't have to worry about educating them. Well no, we all need to continue. I learn stuff all the time from Uncle Charles and many other key Indigenous leaders. I learn all the time. We continue to learn. I was invited a lot of times last year to talk to local Yes groups, and I walked away each time a little bit concerned. Their hearts were in the right place, but their level of knowledge wasn't that strong. And I thought, gee, it's not going to take much from another one of the No Campaign lies and misinformation campaigns for people to be a bit uncertain about what to do. So we still need to educate ourselves. Professor Barry Judd, a really good friend of mine, is the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Indigenous in University of Melbourne, wrote a wonderful article for a special issue of the journal I published last year, talking about the importance of education and why we can see the lack of education over the years as illustrative of our incredible ignorance as a society about the referendum last year. The amount of ridiculous questions we got asked in the events, I spoke at about 60 or 70 events last year. I'm sure you spoke at just as many, Uncle Charles. And the level of questions we got asked indicated the level of ignorance about Australia we had. That, questions just as an example, isn't this going to introduce race into the Constitution? Well, race has always been in the Constitution since it was enacted in 1901. There still is a section in the Constitution, section 25, that gives the power to state governments to exclude an entire race of people. Now that can't be enacted now because of the Racial Discrimination Act, but it's still in the Constitution. Section 51 explicitly forbade Indigenous people from being able to have legislation passed about them by the federal government until 1967. Section 127 didn't allow Indigenous people the right to be counted in the census. So there's still lots of exclusionary clauses and issues about race in the Constitution. So that was just one of many examples in the referendum that I thought illustrated how poor our education system is. I mean, when I grew up, I learned about Captain Cook, Ned Kelly, Farlap and Don Bradman, that was it. My kids have learnt more, but when you look at what they learn, it's more about pre-invasion history. And that's important to learn, but it's a lot easier for the teachers to teach that and for the school systems to do that than to teach about the last 250 years. It's much harder to teach. So they didn't learn a lot about the stolen generation. So we have a real desperate need, not just at schools, at universities as well. I've worked in the university system for 25 years. Very few universities genuinely engage in implementing pedagogical changes to ensure Indigenous studies is taught across the subject. So that's the other key thing, is to continue to learn and continue to educate your colleagues. One of the things that we've talked about a lot, Uncle Charles, during the campaign was the cultural load on Indigenous people during the campaign. That so many organisations, including my own, I had to send a couple of all-staff emails a few times to all staff about this. We had examples of Indigenous staff, they were just going to the cafeteria to get a cup of coffee. They were getting waylaid by all these well-meaning non-Indigenous people going, how do I vote, what should I do? And it's like, just let them go and have a cup of coffee. They might not be an expert, they might not know themselves. So cultural load's always significant in institutions, but this was just ramped into overdrive during the referendum. So we need, as non-Indigenous allies, to take a lot of that cultural load on ourselves. A good mate of mine, Professor Mark Rose from Deakin, just up the road, is a Provost Chancellor of Indigenous there. He often refers to himself as the Black Syria. It's like, Mark, what about this? And Mark, what about that? We need to be aware of making sure that we're educating ourselves and our friends and neighbours and colleagues. Yeah.
That's absolutely critical, and the fact that you brought up cultural load is particularly relevant right now, because cultural load, I think, on a lot of Aboriginal people, especially those in local government and key organisations and educational organisations, is actually heavier now than it even was during the referendum, and it's quite distressing to see it. I'm currently mentoring a number of young Aboriginal people who are working in local governments across Victoria, or Metro Melbourne anyway, and I'm constantly having to speak to their HR directors or to their immediate supervisors and say, look, you've got to stop, just because they're Aboriginal, having people come to them and say, well, tell me about this. Now, the fact is, yeah, I'm an Aboriginal elder and I'm an Aboriginal leader in my community. I don't know how to play the yidaki. I don't have a loincloth. I don't know how to dance. I don't know how to speak in my own language. I don't even know, because of colonisation, where my own country is. And I will not get started on that, because by God I will rant and rave about that. But the fact is that, as Andrew said, so many people, and Mark, yeah, you've mentioned that to me before about Mark Rose, but people going up to Aboriginal people in the lead up to the referendum, well, what should I vote? Oh, for God's sake, it's a bloody referendum. You make your own mind up. That's just an absurd thing to go to anybody and say, oh, well, if you're Aboriginal, you tell me how to vote. Now, that in itself is pretty damn insulting, because that's expecting every single Aboriginal person to be out there to be following the single path. And that's frustrating, because that was thrown at us so many times during the referendum. Well, you're all Aboriginal, why don't you all agree? Well, look, I don't agree with Senator Pat Dodson or Lydia Thorpe or, all those other people all the time, or even the elders on Wadawurrung country or wherever. We have our own minds. And it's unfair to expect us. It's racist. Absolutely. And I hate that word. I loathe it. But it's bloody racist to expect us all to be following that one flag going forward, because there are many different flags, many different influences that give us different ideas. So cultural load is huge.
Absolutely. I think if there was one question I got asked most in that referendum campaign was, but not every Aboriginal person agrees. And my response to that, well, there's about 850,000 Aboriginal people in this country. And I know my little family of 5, we can't agree on what type of takeaway to get. So how can 800,000 people agree? And the answer is they can't. And as Uncle Charles says, it's racist. Why are Aboriginal people seen to be the only group in Australia that has to agree on everything? You wouldn't expect all of Richmond Football Club membership, which is about 100,000, 8 times of them agreeing on every particular social issue. So
any Richmond supporters here, by the way? Yes. I hope not. I really hope not.
So not everyone would agree on that, and that's critical. And the fact is, and the other thing I used to say is, political elections are won by 51, 49% victories. So if Liberals won on 53%, it would be seen as an absolute landslide. Because very rarely has there ever been an election at that magnitude, an absolute landslide. So even though all the polls were showing Indigenous peoples were about 80 to 85% in support of the voice, that was still not enough for some people, even though that's 35% higher than any political election in this country's history. But something I did want to bring up, and Uncle Charles has sort of pushed us in this direction, which is really important, is this notion of racism. So I was really disappointed after the referendum to not only see the standard, not just the standard shock jock saying there was no racism in the campaign, but even progressive journalists. A number of progressive journalists said, oh, there was no racism here. Absolute rubbish. Correct. It was so racist, their campaign. I'll give you one anecdote. He's happy when he's telling this story. Really good friend of mine, he's an Aboriginal elder, he's in his 70s. He was on a plane wearing a voice shirt. He was heckled so badly by these white men in business suits that the flight attendants had to move him to the rear of the plane. And he stayed there until they got off the plane and then waited another 20 minutes because they really didn't know what these guys were going to do. He's an Aboriginal elder who's spent his entire life in campaigning for Indigenous rights. And his life is bookmarked at the other end because in 1967 he was campaigning for the 1967 referendum as a 15-year-old child and was spat on by white voters. So 56 years later, there's the racism there. Aboriginal organisations reporting a 50-fold increase in blocking people on Facebook due to racist posts during the referendum campaign. The amount of questions we got asked during the campaign and many others got asked had a lot of racial overtones. You know, Aboriginal people are going to steal your land. Well, they tried that argument 30 years ago with Mabo, and they were lying then and they were lying now. So racism is permeating through this country, and we need to be honest enough to see that. And we've seen it very much since the referendum as well. I don't think it's happened in this part of the world, which is good, but many places in the country, local governments, again, very strongly connected to reconciliation. Many local governments are having very racist debates about whether to keep acknowledgements the country and welcomes the country. And the debates have been appalling. So racism, very sadly, is alive and well, and we need to, as a reconciliation movement, we need to call it out. We need to be brave. Reconciliation Australia had a theme for National Reconciliation Week a couple of years ago, moving from safe to brave. We need to, as allies, be brave. Call it out where you see it. It can be sometimes confronting if it's a family member or a friend, but you've got to call it out because it's very sadly thriving out there and it's not being recognised.
I just want to point out, isn't it pretty shocking though that not just the fact that your colleague, the elder, had to be moved, but he was moved.
Exactly.
You
Why
know,
didn't they
let's
move
put him
him
down
Yeah,
the back of
absolutely.
the back of thing near the toilets.
They should have put them back down there
Absolutely.
and waited 20 minutes till everyone else had got off the
And
plane.
if you say white privilege doesn't exist, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, it's
Yeah.
alive
Absolutely.
and bloody well.
Absolutely, exactly. Yeah.
But that's interesting, you bring it back to local government and the fact that a lot of the local governments
Yes.
are now starting to question whether they should be having acknowledgements to country. This, once again, is something where you, as citizens, should be keeping an eye on what is your local government doing. Find out what they're doing. Go there and be the voice of reconciliation. You know, every single local government has an open policy when it comes to discussing new initiatives, like policies and plans and stuff like that, where citizens can talk for 2 minutes. It's very, very simple to get onto your local government website, find out what's being discussed, putting your name down as a speaker, whether yes or no, and going there and speaking up about it. And it's not always a comfortable thing to stand up there in this little white colonial place with these elected officials staring at you. But by God, whether you think you've done a good job or a bad job at the end of the night or the end of the meeting, you will be damn proud of yourself. And you will have done something for reconciliation and for a more equitable country. And I believe Andrew wants us to start taking questions now. 5 minutes to take questions?
Okay. So a couple of things I was keen to talk about was the notion of equality. I think one of the things that probably was one of the biggest causes why the referendum failed was Australians have a very poor understanding of what equity means. So to very loosely paraphrase Aristotle, inequality doesn't just result from equal peoples or people in equal circumstances being treated unequally. Inequality can also result from people in unequal circumstances being treated equally. So we all know the first part. I've got 3 children. If I gave 2 of them a chocolate bar and not the 3rd one, all hell would break loose. Because people in equal circumstances, if they're treated unequally, that is inequity. But likewise, if you have people in different circumstances and you treat them exactly the same, that is also inequality. Now, we can understand that very easily with a simple thought experiment. I used to say this to my students years ago. With all the bushfires we have, imagine, after Black Saturday, obviously a number of years ago now, the Victorian government said, okay, we're going to give every household in the state $10,000 because of the bushfires. Well, the first reaction would be, well, such and such lives in Toorak, and the fires went nowhere near their house. I lost my entire property. How can you treat us exactly the same? People understand in those circumstances that it's inequitable to treat people in different circumstances the same. Yet with Indigenous people, one of the biggest things we heard a lot in the campaign was, why do Indigenous people get a voice? Well, many other groups already have a voice, and there's a lot of strong arguments behind that. But what's the view behind that argument? Well, the view behind it is a very simplistic and unsophisticated understanding of what equity is. And I think that's something that's really significant. I think, again, a call to arms in the reconciliation movement is try to find ways to educate your friends and colleagues about the importance of a more nuanced understanding of what equity is in this country, because that's a really key area that I think we're struggling with in this country a lot.
I think that is also quite appropriate when it comes to, I don't know, have you all heard of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? I won't embarrass you by asking how many of you have read it, but it's not, well, we're nerds, we like that sort of stuff. Do read it, because it really speaks to economic privilege, it speaks to political representation for Indigenous peoples. And this is such an important thing. So please read UNDRIP. It's easily obtainable from the United Nations website. Just type UNDRIP, UNDRIP. Simple PDF, very pretty little PDF too, which you will download. But understand that, because a lot of people will say, well, yeah, but Aboriginal people have got exactly the same rights as every other Australian. And, under the Constitution, to a degree, we do. We can stand for political office, we have the same economic rights and all that, but the fact is, now I wasn't really going to bring this up, but because of the reality of transgenerational trauma, which affects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, every one of them and every one of us in a different way, it's not an equal playing pitch. It just isn't equal at all. So this is why you need to understand this about equity and equality. I think what Andrew said is really important. Now, Buddy, I reckon we should take questions from the audience.
Can I say one thing about UNDRIP?
No,
Sorry. UNDRIP's really important. And Senator Patrick Dodson, one of my absolute heroes, he's made an incredible contribution to reconciliation in this country. One of the last things he did in Parliament was he chaired a committee to look at UNDRIP. And so very sadly, despite the fact Australia signed UNDRIP a number of years ago, we've not really done a lot with it.
Correct.
And so his committee came up with some key recommendations, and we really need to talk about UNDRIP in this country like Canada has, for example. Canada's enacted an UNDRIP action plan. It's putting it there's putting a framework around all domestic legislation that has to address UNDRIP. So learn about UNDRIP, because we need to implement that in this country. And when you look at the various commitments, one of them is remarkably similar to what we asked for in the Voice campaign as well. So that the notion that Indigenous peoples should have a voice in matters that concern them. Yeah. Over to questions.
I will respond to that. Andrew's quite right. It's a very good question. It was a question I didn't want asked. I see nothing wrong in the word. And this goes back to what I said earlier on this evening, where if a question is asked with respect and it's asked respectfully, then I will take it respectfully and I won't take offence. Reconciliation is not dead. Reconciliation is a movement forward. I believe that. I've yet to hear personally a good argument as to why reconciliation is offensive. I still support reconciliation. I report the work of Reconciliation Victoria. They're one of my organisation's key strategic partners. I partner with local reconciliation groups on reconciliation work. Please, at 66, don't teach me another bloody word to say. I'm sticking with reconciliation and I find no offence with it.
So,
all right?
Yeah, so back in when the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation set up reconciliation in the 1990s, what it said was reconciliation can mean many different things to many different people. And the idea was to get a broad movement. The problem with that statement, though, is no one really knows what it means. So myself and other academics and community leaders over many years have argued a whole range of different areas. What I strongly advocate for, reconciliation means a broad range of things. Many people see reconciliation as people walking hand in hand, singing Kumbaya and walking off together. Now, relationships is important, but so is addressing Indigenous rights. So is recognising treaty, self-determination. So is addressing practices of whiteness and racism. So is truth-telling. so is addressing health and education issues, so is engaging in power relationships. So Reconciliation Victoria and the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, and all throughout all the writings I've ever done, you're looking at those key issues of reparative justice in a really much more nuanced way. So I agree with the criticisms from many Indigenous people about the word reconciliation, because often reconciliation is practiced not in that broad way, but in what I call performative reconciliation. And again, I talk about that in the book. Performative reconciliation is often about people wearing T-shirts. Not that there's anything wrong with wearing a T-shirt, I've got plenty of T-shirts myself. But if that's all you do, or as you say, Uncle Charles, once a year you do a march, it's really what you're doing to perform for other people. So performative reconciliation, that should be put in a shed and just locked away. But reconciliation in a deeper sense is what I and many others advocate for. So that's how I would address that sort of criticism. I understand people's concerns. Why, for example, do so many RAP organisations, did so many of them not actually engage with the referendum? They're just doing performative reconciliation in my view. But those organisations that did come out strongly advocate for the referendum, at my university we did a web page that tried to educate as many staff and students and alumni as possible, doing those concrete practical things. That part of reconciliation is not dead. But performative reconciliation shouldn't even be implemented, because you need to do those other key things as well. Thank you for that. And just that sort of local involvement, community involvement is fantastic. I had the privilege of talking to a reconciliation group at Inverloch on Thursday, and they were talking about their campaign. They worked with traditional owners to change their electorate. Now, their electorate used to be called Macmillan. It was named after a genocidal murderer, Angus Macmillan, who still has statues commemorating him. But at the very least, he's no longer on that federal electorate. So that's a great example of community engagement leading to concrete work, and that is reconciliation, because that's truth-telling. Yeah.
And I'm just going to throw in also, because thank you, Councillor, for bringing that up, but with the elections, I know that there's a lot of fear, not just within Victoria and Australia, but actually internationally. There is a great deal of fear about fringe elements working their way in and bringing in very radical right-wing ideas which could just, I think, sabotage the reconciliation and other movements under this guise of social propriety. I urge everybody, just as Andrew urges people to educate themselves when it comes to politics and your politicians, whether they're local, state or federal, please research them, understand and vote accordingly, because we're the only people who bring these politicians into power, and we are the people, not the politicians, who must collectively bear the responsibility on our shoulders. But beware the cockroaches that are coming in the 2024 local government elections, because they are scurrying like crazy.
And it got worse as the referendum went on, because if you looked at the data early on there was a really strong support amongst young people, and that eroded over time. It's really, I think education is the key thing. We have to be better at teaching Indigenous studies and Indigenous knowledge at universities to prepare the teachers. I've talked to lots of teachers, and they are woefully underprepared at universities. Most universities don't do a good job with their teacher education programs. And so it's a bit hard to expect teachers who've had no training. My wife's a teacher, and in a state university she did her degree, and in 4 years she had one subject which was like basically on the other. So 1 week was on Indigenous people, 1 week was on multicultural, 1 week was on people with disabilities. Like, this is unbelievable. And the 1 week that she was going to get on Indigenous education was a public holiday. So in her 4-year degree, I mean, she's unfortunately married to me, so she learns a lot from that. But all her colleagues went out with not one bit of information, and so that sadly still exists in many cases. So education is the key. I know the Europe Justice Commission has just done a public inquiry on education. I think education is absolutely important, but we also have to look at ways to educate beyond the formal structures within our areas. I mean, 1967 was won through kitchen table conversations and by people just having chats to to the people in their sphere of influence. We need to still do that. We shouldn't be running scared because of the referendum result. We need it more than ever to educate people about the truth in this country. Truth telling is absolutely critical.
Truth telling is absolutely critical. And my question to you is, how many people, what year students do you teach? Year 12. How many times did you have speakers come in to speak to your students?
0. We weren't allowed to even wear our yes badge.
I saw this unfortunately in a lot of schools. Andrew and I both spoke at a lot of schools. Matter of fact, I think around about 30% of my speaking engagements during the lead up to the referendum were to Year 12 students. And I was very, very blessed that I was able to work with local reconciliation groups who helped facilitate this. But I was able to get into local schools and talk about the truth of the Voice to Parliament and the referendum. Now, I did not wear a yes shirt. At no stage in that referendum did I wear a yes shirt. I've got one in my van now, which I've never worn. I didn't need to. I wore this shirt, which is my company shirt, Victorian Aboriginal News, and my goal was to get in there and speak to students about the truth, to answer every single question they had with authority and with information, whether it was about the Constitution, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, or the proposed amendment, that simple amendment to the Constitution. That's the things we spoke about. And the relationships that I now have with those schools is second to none. Unfortunately, one of the schools that I spoke at, I don't know if I told you this, but one of the students there, her mother was a member of the Conservative Party in the upper house. I had another cancellation the next day because I was very thrilled. There was a complaint made against me for speaking the truth. I'd never, ever advocated yes. Never once. I did not hand out tickets. I didn't hand out anything. I just spoke the truth. So, look, educating, getting people in to speak about things, I think that's important. And in schools where you don't have the support of your board and the department and your principals, I don't know what to do.
The department sent out a directive.
Oh, they did too, didn't they?
Yep.
Yes, I remember that. Yes.
Yeah,
But I'll tell you now, a lot of schools went against it.
And I was able, like Uncle Charles, I went in there, I mean, I was a passionate yes supporter, obviously, but I went in there as an academic. And that was my way to get in there. But certainly, it was much easier to get into private schools because they didn't have to follow that edict.
And Catholic schools, yeah.
It's really important to think, we're not just talking about this as something that happened and we just rule the line through it, because we need to look at what happened and learn from it, because it's going to happen again this year with treaty, as Uncle Charles said. Now, fortunately, it doesn't require a change to the Victorian Constitution, because that's just a legislative change. We don't need to have a referendum for that. But it doesn't require that. However, there's nothing to stop a future government getting in and abolishing a treaty. So we do need to educate this community. The other day, the Victorian National Party leader said something that was straight out of John Howard from the 1990s, a country can't make a treaty with itself. Well, tell that to Canada or the United States or New Zealand or every other single former British colony on this planet. We are the only former British colony on this planet that doesn't have a treaty with Indigenous peoples. And they're very successful on many of these treaties. Canada had a treaty signed in 1989. In none of it, which is a remarkable treaty. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed 184 years ago, and here we are in this country still debating it. So a treaty is simply an agreement between two parties. It doesn't have to be between two countries, and a treaty will just set out the rules, the roles, the responsibility, the obligations of each group. And can you tell me seriously, Victorian government does a good job with out-of-home care? There are more children being taken now in Victoria than there were during the stolen generation. That's the best practice? I don't think so. What the Europe Justice Commission is doing through Sue Ann Hunter and many other key leaders is leading this work. So this work will then inform the development of a treaty led by the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And the treaty will have in there things to address out-of-home care, will address criminal justice reforms. And that's going to be a lot better for both Indigenous people, but also for the broader community. Because the thing we also need to remember as a reconciliation movement, we don't operate under a deficit approach. Many do, but that's wrong. We should operate under a strength-based approach. A First Nations voice to Parliament would have been great for Indigenous people, and it would have been really good for the rest of the country as well. Having a RAP is great for Indigenous employees in an organisation, and it makes the organisation a better organisation if it's done properly. So strength-based approach is critical as well. So, sorry, that's a roundabout way of saying, with your students now, finding ways to educate them about a treaty is really important because we want more informed citizens moving forward. So 5 years down the track, we just don't get treaty reversed. That would be devastating.
This is really interesting. There's actually an investigation going in, and there's information being sought by the government on public interest journalism and on truth in journalism. And I know that when I went to speak about this, it was an online presentation, that I was absolutely dismayed that a lot of the truth checking that we had during the referendum from the ABC and RMIT and I've forgotten the other one. Anyway, the other one too, they're no longer funding, or they're breaking apart. We've now got Meta, which owns Facebook, deciding that it will no longer carry reputable Australian news simply because it has to pay money for it. And this is devastating on accurate news, even on social media. What we're going to see, I don't have good news for you. What we're going to see is, I think, a blast of more misinformation. Because here's the big thing, and the Conservatives did it really well in the referendum. They played the country beautifully. And Con, you've got to admit that. The number of people who would just espouse the claptrap that we heard coming from people like, and I always try to fit this in any presentation, from people like Peter Credlin, Paul Murray and Andrew Bolt. How many times did we hear people just echo that crap and corruption all the time? That's going to continue to happen. What we need to do is, I think the government needs to start funding proper public interest journalism. Now, that's a huge thing. That's not going to happen here. There's no call to action for you right now. As individuals, I strongly suggest that instead of waiting to hear or read something in the news, then go to the very source of things. Go and download the work or view the work that's been done on the Euro Justice Commission. You'll find the truth there. And as Andrew said, the police commissioner was on talking about the fact, we don't have this policy of training required. That's where your news is. And that's what we need to do.
The other one was AAP.
Yes, thank you.
I got contacted by them several times during the campaign to correct some mistruths. One of them was that the amount of actual money spent on Aboriginal affairs is a fraction of what the Conservatives were claiming, because what they do is they just get the entire budget divided by the number of Aboriginal people in Australia and say that's what they're getting. So suddenly Aboriginal people are getting money because of all the money we spend on defence. I mean, it's ludicrous. So the amount of money Aboriginal people get is a minuscule amount compared to that. So that was one of the things. Another one I got asked about was, is it true that if we get the voice up, we're going to all have to pay the rent? I mean, the lies that came out, and you're right, there's a expectation now, I think, that this is how public discourse is had. I mean, I spoke to senior multicultural leaders who, multicultural communities were copying the same fear campaigns the rest of us were about losing your backyards, about paying higher taxes, but many multicultural communities were being targeted by no campaigners saying, if the voice gets up, you'll be deported. So the most horrendous lies were being said. And that's a really concerning issue. One of the big issues, I think, is that there's no requirement for the Australian Electoral Commission to fact check the papers, the official papers. So independent news agencies did that, and the amount of lies that came out in the official No Campaign pamphlet was just appalling. So that has to change. That's a simple legislative thing that can change to require truth in advertising for politics, both for elections but also for referendums. That's the key thing.
Oh, no, you go first on this
Okay,
one.
sure.
I need to think on this.
Yeah,
I want to think.
It's a really good question. I don't think we're saying that truth-telling is there's only one truth, because people do have different views of what it can mean. But what truth-telling really is about is ensuring that Indigenous truths are being told, about the histories being told. So, for example, down at Portland, where one of Victoria's first massacres occurred down there, there's no monument there. There's nothing to acknowledge what happened. So the work in this state, at least, is being led by the Europe Justice Commission. So what they're doing is they're asking for submissions. It could be written submissions, it could be poetry, it could be photographs, it could be video recordings. And that's all going into the mix for them to have a more accurate record of what truth is in this state. So you're right, everyone's going to have their own truth about something. You have a family argument, you're going to have different views all the time. But it's not that sort of level of truth. I think it's more about the fact that throughout history, I mean, W.H. Stanner talked about the Great Australian Silence during the 1910s to the 1970s, but we still are under a Great Australian Silence now because there's just key areas of history that just aren't being understood, and that's the part of truth we need to understand what happens. We need to understand, as I said before, the history of stolen generations, but not only that, what's happening since the stolen generations official policy has stopped. Well, governments are still taking Indigenous children away, so that's the truth that we need to know, and how we educate people about that is there's a lot of information. At least one excuse in the Great Australian Silence period that W.H. Stanner talks about. There weren't many books, there weren't many documentaries, whereas now there's amazing Indigenous filmmakers who are doing extraordinary documentaries. Rachel Perkins, for example. There's some extraordinary Indigenous authors that are writing amazing work. There's extraordinary Indigenous media, Victorian Aboriginal News, National Indigenous Times, the Courier Mail. Many multiple ways for people to get their truth that they haven't been able to in the past. So that's sort of what I'd argue is the key part about truth telling. But it's not saying there is a single truth, but there's just an absence of key areas in our history. The other thing I'd say about truth telling, people often refer to it as the past. I'd argue truth telling is not just about the past, it's about the present, but critically it's about the future. What sort of society do we want for ourselves in this country? And that's where truth telling can come into it as well.
I'm also, and thank you for plugging VA in, I appreciate that. But it's really interesting. I look at it from a different perspective. I'm wondering how many people really give a damn about the truth. Now, I can look at it in a numbers-based model that over the past few weeks I've been out to Corranderk, which is a very important mission site, twice to interview Uncle Dave Wandon, who's a Wurundjeri Woiwurrung elder and one of the two lawmen of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung. And we spoke about the history of Corranderk and what happened to the people there and how it all came about and what's happening now. Now, we can promote that like crazy, but we can't make people listen to it. And that's only one of many, I think, audio and visual and written assets that are out there. As Andrew said, there are an amazing number of documentaries. Do people even want to watch them? That's just it. The truth, this sounds like something out of, sci-fi. The truth is out there, but do people even give a damn? And my honest response is probably not.
And that's maybe we might want to look at that word truth telling. As important as truth telling is, I think from what Uncle Charles is saying, I think we also need to have truth listening. We need to be as allies listening to the truth as well.
Yeah.